Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And today we are dealing with the ethical dilemma around the concept of whether or not you can forgive a corporation or an institution or an industry. And this comes to us from a faithful friend and listener to Thinking Out Loud podcast. I won't use his name because I forgot to ask him for permission, but he probably wouldn't mind. But anyway, so real life situation here. And this has to do with carjacking, which you've seen headlines or you've experienced it yourself, or you know somebody who has had their car broken into one way or the other. This is becoming kind of a ubiquitous feature of urban life for most Americans, particularly if you own a Hyundai or a Kia. And not all of them, just certain brands, certain years. This is kind of a well-known thing that there are certain cars that are easier to steal than others. One of the reasons I want to take this question up is because this, for the listener, isn't theoretical. This has happened twice. So his wife and his brother-in-law both have had their cars broken into twice. And because they own vehicles in the era in which it's kind of known that you can carjack these, the manufacturers have issued recalls. You can go in, you can take them in, and you can have them upgrade it so that they can't be stolen once somebody breaks in. But the trouble is, Cameron, like if that upgrade is in place, somebody going by doesn't know that you have that upgrade in your car, so they can still break into your car and try to steal it. Even if they can't steal it, they still smash the window in your car. Mm-hmm. So here we have a listener who's, several rear windshields, of payment into replacing stuff for cars that didn't actually get stolen, but got broken into thinking that they could be stolen. And this raises this is just kind of a tragic indictment of our culture in general, in which carjacking is a part of what is this like? Now we're doing Grand Theft Auto in real life. Except I don't really know if going after Kias in the video game version, but here are the ethical dilemmas that are at play here. Particularly one of the specific questions that he asked about is, how do you respond to, so you have a company that builds a product that then gets stolen or broken into, vandalized in some way. That company then offers recall, offers to replace the parts to make it right. And then there's a class action lawsuit on top of that, $200 million in this case, for people to be compensated for damages done to their vehicle because it was identified as one that could be broken into. And the question here is, should you participate in a class action lawsuit to receive funding from a company to recoup a damage that you paid, even though the company wasn't specifically responsible for the damage that was done to your vehicle? This is, by and large, there are many reasons to do that. One of these is like a TikTok challenge. I think you know something about that, Cameron. Not about stealing cars, but about like the TikTok challenge, or the gang activity goes around of like, hey, here's kind of a way to initiation rights or ways to break in and steal vehicles. Before I jump into kind of my initial thoughts on maybe how to start framing a way to think through the ethical implications of how to bore into this type of question, because if we think of this as a type of a thing, whether this be class action lawsuits in general or suing for injustices or infringements, do you know about this phenomena in your area? What have you heard about it? What have you seen? And do you have any other context or story you want to bring in before I start trying to stroke my chin here and come up with a framework for us thinking through this?
Well, I first heard about it when I was speaking in Chicago. This was such a problem in the Chicago area that I think people were being actively discouraged from purchasing Kias. I didn't realize that Hyundai fit into this category as well.
That was new to me too.
Yes. So the Kia, that was the TikTok challenge that really made that go viral. But in the city of Chicago, it was so bad that either people were being discouraged from buying Kias, or there was some sort of a mandate possibly on not selling them at all. So that was happening. There was a massive uptick I think in general, Nathan, there has been an uptick in carjackings in a lot of American cities, period. That's not necessarily connected with TikTok challenges. That's a surge in crime. So there is that. I can tell you an experience that I had that is somewhat similar, and similar in the sense that it involved a vehicle, similar in the sense that it's difficult to locate the blame, similar in the sense that also it's an outworking of what we would call the law of unintended consequences. So several years ago. This would have been probably 2011, 2012, somewhere in that range. This was when my wife and I were in our first apartment. I went downstairs. We were on the third floor, so I went down all the stairs. This is winter. It's very cold outside, ready to go to work. And I turned on some of you who are familiar with vehicles will know where this is going immediately. Turned the keys and the ignition to my Honda CRV. And I thought, why does my car sound like a motorcycle? And then a couple cars over at the same time, one of my neighbors, who happened to be a school teacher, turned his Honda on. And lo and behold, his CRV also sounded like a motorcycle. So this is when I learned that the catalytic converter on a CRV has inside of it, it has platinum as inside of it. And so it's actually very easy to remove the catalytic converter and to extract that platinum. And somebody had hit all of the CRVs that we could, most of the CRVs in our apartment complex. Everybody just got hit all at once. So yeah, it was, and that was not a cheap, ripoff to come back from. And all of us were out of pocket for that. So it was one of those instances where you realize in hindsight that it's hard to even call that a design flaw in this case, because this was something completely unanticipated, but it became a liability, and future CRVs were updated to exclude that possibility. But I'm certain that people had their vehicles damaged because they were trying still to get the catalytic converter off and extract so it was so all that to say, I feel a bit of solidarity on this one.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about the catalytic converter one, because stealing, rims, tires,
sure,
different things. So let's zoom out and frame. And I think sometimes if you're in a kind of an ethical quandary, if we can by analogy come up with some other types of similar situations to try to think through the ethics of it, and then we'll do a compare and a contrast of whether or not this is the same. So think of this, Cameron. Let's do this little case study, your thought experiment. Let's imagine that you go to a farmer's. Actually, no, you and your family, you take your kids to go pick a pumpkin in the fall. Let's imagine that you and your wife and your two kids, you go to your little hayride and you pick your pumpkin or whatever, and you buy a pumpkin and you bring it back, and you put it on your doorstep, and then someone steals the pumpkin and, I don't know, throws it as a road sign somewhere. Do you feel like the farmer's market that sold you the pumpkin is responsible for your pumpkin being stolen? I'm going to say that I'm guessing that you're going to say no to that. It doesn't seem like it's the farmer's fault that somebody stole your pumpkin. Right. Now, immediately, if we try to map that onto the idea of somebody stealing your car,
sure,
a couple things in mind. So obviously, it seems to us different because the price structure is so different. One's tens of thousands of dollars. One's $5. So, but if we're just looking at the principle of the matter, there is an element there that is similar, that it seems more serious to us just because of the size of it. But if we're actually looking at the ethical oughtness of it, by and large, we all believe that you ought to be able to purchase something and put it on your property and it stay there. And that is the foundation of the laws of the land in which we live, that is the ideal. So technically, Kia ought to be able to sell you a vehicle that doesn't have any locks on the door, and that should be fine. And you can all immediately chuckle because that is not the world that we live in. But I'm saying, as far as basic laws and property rights go, that seems to be the idea, is that you should have the right to purchase something that nobody else comes onto your property and messes with or steals or takes. Now, here's the fundamental difference that I think is, when you buy a pumpkin, you are not also purchasing the pumpkin protection plan. Like, that would be kind of funny, actually, if you could go to a farmer's market and you're like, you can buy the pumpkin for $4.99, but for an extra $1.50, we can ensure that no one will steal this pumpkin. Is what you're buying with a car the item itself, or are you buying the item plus the concept that it's not stealable? And it took me a while to come
Yeah.
to this conclusion, because on the upfront side of it, it seems like steal a pumpkin, steal a car. It's both theft, it's both a violation of property, and it's both the responsibility of the thief, not of the producer of the pumpkin or the car. But in a technologically oriented world, suddenly in my mind, there's the question of, am I also purchasing the anti-theft protection of this item at the same time? And for me, that doesn't really change the overall calculation on who I think is actually at fault here. But that, to me, that seems to be the difference. Like when I'm running through the different ways of thinking about that, that seems to me to be the difference here is, do I think that when I buy a car, I'm also purchasing the capacity, or I'm also purchasing the expectation that it will not be stolen? So that's where, am I missing something there? Or does that similarity with the pumpkin and the difference with the pumpkin make sense? Or is there another wrinkle that I'm missing
Well,
here?
the only wrinkle I want to revisit or introduce rather before we get there, I think it's an intriguing question, is let's bring in the word responsibility. Somebody steals that sign, so to the pumpkin analogy. So is the farmer technically at fault? No, the person who stole the sign is, but is the farmer responsible? This is after all the farmer's land. And when he
No, I'm saying you bought the pumpkin, and you brought the pumpkin to your house, and somebody stole the pumpkin from your property.
If it's your property, yes, then yeah, then that would definitely
so I'm
obtain.
not talking about stealing a pumpkin out of the pumpkin patch. I'm stealing, like, so I'm
Sure.
trying to make the parallel here to like buying the
Make it
car.
as tight
You
as you
bought the
can.
pumpkin, you brought it home, and somebody stole your pumpkin. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that makes sense. Again, yeah, the major discrepancy. So are we then trying to sell a guarantee? Well, yes, obviously that is part of what we try to do. It's not just, any kind of warranty does that. It tries to, you're trying to preclude as much risk as you possibly can. We all understand, I think, theoretically, that it's not possible to preclude all risk, but yeah, you pay for some sort of a warranty service and all that. I mean, that's why. And in the United States, the way that we settle those disputes then is, of course, through litigation. That's our country is kind of known for that. And we're pretty notorious for that. So,
okay, all right. Let me lean into it this way. So let's think of it this way. If somebody steals your car, who's going to get blamed for it? Well, your insurance company is going to blame you. So there's that component. In fact, I talked to somebody recently who had a friend who had their car stolen twice, and they were nice cars, like upper end ones. And then their insurance company wouldn't insure them anymore because their car had been stolen twice. Well, theoretically, it's not the person's fault that their car got stolen. It's the fault of the person that it got stolen. And pretty clearly, it's not actually the fault of the auto manufacturer that the car gets stolen. It's the fault of the person who does the stealing.
The thief, yes.
So the thief is the one who is the moral agent in here that is at fault. We're making a categorical moral judgment that stealing cars is wrong. You heard it first here on Thinking Out Loud, folks, in case you're confused about that. So what the listener's question here, though, is, let's say then that there's a class action lawsuit, in this case, I think $200 million, that in addition to fixing all of the cars, that the automaker is now expected to pay out toward people who have been damaged. You suddenly have the auto manufacturer is bearing the financial responsibility for the theft that another individual perpetrated.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're probably bearing some financial responsibility on two accounts. One, you're paying for your back window or your catalytic converter, or your insurance rate goes up on your car. So in this case, everybody is being fiscally penalized
except
who wasn't at fault.
Except for the person who's actually at fault, yeah.
So I think that's the tragedy of the situation here. Now, so let's say then, if we can say that everybody is being penalized except for the person who's at fault, we hear a lot of conversation about injustices that happen in the legal system, in the judicial system. It seems like weekly, there's somebody who was released after 32 years in prison, serving a life sentence for something that DNA exonerated them from or whatever. And so we would say, here are massive misfires of justice that are not in the best interest of the person. What happens when there's a misfire of justice that is in your interest? So let's say that we think that it's unjust for a company to have to pay you because somebody else broke your property. But the fiscal outcome of that injustice is a financial benefit to you.
Mm-hmm.
Just let that sink in a second.
Yep.
So we're saying that justice is not happening, but it fiscally benefits you if something unjust happens. How then do you decide whether or not you want to participate in that system? That seems to me to be the question of, okay, obviously you could say that this is a fiscal good. It's a different question of saying, do I want to be the type of person who participates in that system? So this is where our concepts of virtue and our moral wholeness and well-being are going to conflict with our finances.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a different example. So my wife just got something in the mail of like, oh, this medical clinic you visited 4 years ago, the records were hacked, blah, blah, blah. You can join this class action lawsuit and get $75 or whatever, however it comes divided out. If you just submit this claim, whatever. Okay, well, first of all, we don't know for sure that her information was part of that. Secondly, we haven't seen any adverse effect of that. So basically, the idea there is you can get $75 from the company because somebody else hacked their system. So you're going to want to ask the question, is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
Not, is that
beneficial?
Huzzah, like Christmas miracle. So I think you're what
we have to.
So legally what is right and financially what is beneficial might not always be the right thing to do. And I'm going to leave that there because I'm sure you want to comment.
Well, I just want to distill it into a phrase. We have to distinguish financial and legal benefits from ethical commitments. Ideally, they will go hand in hand. Ideally, going hand in hand with the law is to your advantage, but there are times where a conflict will emerge, such as this. And it's important to also, and this isn't necessarily helping anything. This is just a description of some of the conundrums we run into in the modern world, where we have these vast, sprawling systems that are designed to try to preclude all risk. And in many cases, these systems work well. Warranties have been helpful in my life. I'm grateful for them. And I'm grateful for many of the modern conveniences that we have and the developing technologies of cars. But every new technology comes with it completely unpredictable risks. Just everyone. Think about those new Tesla trucks they look like, well, they're kind of abstract looking.
You're going to say they're hideous.
I was going to say they're absolutely hideous because they are. But I'll just
so abstract. Okay,
yeah, but okay. I want everybody to know that Nathan, kind of egged me on that one. But those will.
No, I put words in your mouth and then push you.
But you weren't wrong. But those are. Do we know all of the possible deficiencies in those? No, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface. And you bring this up a lot, Nathan. In the modern world, we spend a lot of time, a lot of money trying to answer who's at fault. And you've also asked, is there such a thing as an accident anymore? Kid falls off a swing in a playground. If that happened, it happened, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago. It was an accident. These days, though, somebody's getting sued. That's deficient, playground equipment. Something has to happen. Somebody has to pay for this and compensate me and my family for our pain. So you run into these cases where, morally speaking, there's a very straightforward part to this. A thief, in this case, with these cars, is at fault. Or a group of thieves, people who did this stealing property, they're at fault. But of course they're not. They're often not caught. And so then it becomes very nebulous. Okay, what do we do? Lawsuits happen and litigation happens. And then we find ourselves in the unlikely position of benefiting financially from something that is not necessarily right. So,
yeah, well, because there's a little bit of a parallel to concept of reparations here as well, right?
yeah, sure.
Can you charge somebody who wasn't directly connected in an abuse? Can you penalize them financially and have that be seen as justice? It's like some people might be squirming, and it sounds a little weird to say it, but
yes, it's not dissimilar.
Philosophically and logically speaking, it's not as dissimilar as you would think. So I know I can give some examples here, Cameron, of I had a brother and his son who were hit by a truck last year, fairly life-altering injuries.
Yep.
And said, you know what? We can't forgive the person who did it and sue them. I had a cousin, 14 years old, who was killed by a drunk driver on a tractor. And my aunt decided not to own that person's farm because didn't want to be the kind of people who benefited in life for that kind of reason. And it really didn't change the outcome of life being taken there. And so there are people who are, the thing that you're up against is we can complain about everything being a litigated society, except for when it benefits us. And I think there will be a handful of you who are listening to Thinking Out Loud who say, look, this is the way that the system works.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a bummer, but give me my money.
Let's be realistic here.
Okay. Yep. Let's be realistic. Let's be pragmatic. And you know what? That is the legal system and the legal structure and the expectation. And I bet you there are kids smashing windows who think, you know what? I'm not really hurting this guy. His insurance will cover it. You know, there's that kind of, somebody else will always be responsible for my actions. The question we're having to ask ourselves here is, do we want to be the kind of people who participate in that system? Or how do we think carefully about what we're really doing, or what are we really giving moral or virtuous assent to by what we participate in and what we benefit from? Now, that can get complicated on a whole host of levels, from the things that you invest your retirement in to whether or not you even want to receive, points on your credit card because that's coming from poor people who aren't able to pay their credit. You can run this into a million directions, and I'm not meaning to overly complicate it in that way, other than just to say, I really appreciate the question because the moral implications of it are significant. When Aaron and I lived in Dallas, we had a friend of a friend who needed a place to stay on the way through. And so I met this young couple who were on their way to an art show or something. And he told this story that before he was a Christian, when he was in high school, there was a girl was getting off the bus and kind of gave him and his friend, he's like, it was a weird look, but I didn't know how to interpret it. He's like, we didn't know what it meant. So that night we went back and we slashed the tires on their family vehicles. And then a week later, we went back and did it again. And then he became a Christian, and he was so torn up remembering that because the family had moved. He didn't have a way to contact, that he had cost that family 8 car tires for something that might not have even been an insult and was a juvenile response to an insult if it had been. And he had no way to go back and to apologize and to ask for forgiveness. And it was really interesting to see him wrestle with feeling guilty for something that he would liked to have been forgiven of, but didn't have the means to ask for forgiveness because of something stupid that he had done when he was young. That's the opposite side of how we often think about this. When my dad was in high school, he was with a bunch of friends. He was in the back of a truck. They were throwing apples at stuff, and he threw an apple at a guy's shed, and it broke the window out of it. And they just kept going. And 5 years later, when he got a little more serious with the Lord and with life, he went back to the guy. He's like, hey, do you remember when, somebody threw an apple through your window? That was me. And offered to pay for it and had a really good conversation with the guy. And actually the guy ended up offering to loan him money to finish college, and it turned into a good relationship. And so I think we want to be, as Christians, people who say, what is the ideal outcome of this? And the ideal outcome of this is not that you get 8750 from the automotive company. The ideal outcome would that a restoration of relationship would happen between you and the person who perpetrated this. That there would be a time in which they would come to their senses and that they would seek forgiveness, and that they would be your friend and brother and sister in Christ in the future. Now, I know that sounds totally weird and a pie in the sky and idealistic and all of that, but it is not outside of the bounds of the biblical expectation for the restoration and restitution of human relationships. One of the ways that this was brought home to me, it's been 5-6 years now. I was staying with a family in Chicago, and they had a mantle, hearth, fireplace, and on the mantle there was a brick, and it didn't fit in with the decor. Let's just put it that way. Like a very nice house, and then there's a brick, and so I was standing there by the fireplace. It's like, so what's the story with the brick? And the guy laughed, and he's like, you know what? He said somebody threw that brick through the windshield of our car during a riot. I forget, it'd been a couple months earlier. And he's like, and yeah, obviously you don't want a brick through your windshield. He's like, but we decided to keep the brick and put it on our fireplace as a reminder to pray for the person who threw the brick. And I thought, you know what? That's a pretty mature response to that. Okay. Is it good to have a brick through your windshield? No. Does it cost you? Yes. Is it, do you feel like you've been violated? Yes. Is it morally responsible on behalf of somebody else? Yes. Is it going to cost you fiscally? Yes. Is it just a regular nuisance? Absolutely. But to keep a memento of the thing, to say there is a human made in the image of God here who is at play, and I will pray for God to convict them and to bring them into a proper relationship with himself and with other people. That is taking the high road. That is taking the Christ-like posture in response to suffering. I think, what does it mean to bless those who persecute you when people are trying to steal your Kia? That's what's at stake here. And to pray for those who, despitefully mistreat you. This is where Christianity jumps out of the category of interesting thought experiments and then gets some, the rubber really hits the road here on what did Jesus mean by these things. And so I think that's the spot that I don't know that I'm giving a clear-cut answer to the question, other than to frame it in such a way is to think carefully through of what does this say about me? And what's the shape? What does this do to my posture and my shape if I participate in the system in this way? There's almost a little bit of a sense, Cameron, here. One more yammering on here and then get you to comment, that there's a sense in which when, like in John 10, I think it's in 18, Jesus says, "No one takes my life from me. I choose to lay it down." So you could look at Jesus as a victim of an unjust system, of Roman, Jewish, whatever hierarchies, infighting, politicized, whatever. So you could see Jesus as the victim. Jesus chose not to see himself as the victim, but as a willing participant in doing things a different way. And so he's like, you're not taking it from me. I'm choosing to lay it down. So there is a sense in which your catalytic converter's been stolen, your window's been smashed, your car's been stolen, whatever. Or somebody demands something of you. You've been victimized. Somebody has taken something from you. On the other hand, you can think of yourself as the victim, or you can say, I'm the person who is not going to respond in the way that the world expects me to, and I'm going to pray for and seek the good of the person who does it. Suddenly it changes you from being the one who's in the victim posture. So when you take the brick out of your car seat that's come through the window and you put it on your mantle and say, I will pray for this person, that in my mind, it fundamentally changes the calculus of the identity of the person in your relationship to the other person. You're back now in saying there's a God who sees all, justice will be served. That's outside of the Kia litigation. There's a God who sees, cares, and knows and rewards the way of the righteous and punishes the way of the wicked. And one of these will prosper. And I choose this because my confidence in justice happening comes from the Lord. That's a live option that's on the table in this conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that you've helpfully framed this, Nathan, is, and I think it's also obvious that we're not directly answering the question, because I don't know that this is a question with a healthy direct answer. What you get are, I think, a set of healthy questions. What am I supporting by participating in this? What will my support, how will it affect me internally? That's a big virtue ethics question, by the way. Not what will this do to somebody else? What will the outcome be for somebody else? But what will it do to me inside, internally? What will it do to my soul? And then finally, what do my actions say about my belief in God's justice? I think those are three very good questions to ask. What am I supporting by participating? What's it doing to me? And what's it say about my belief in God's justice? I think prayerfully working through those, Nathan, you can add, but I think that might be a really healthy exercise, not just in the cases involving, Hyundais and Kias, but for many of us who live in America with the system as it is, the legal system as it is, where in some shape or form, most of us will face circumstances like this or along these lines.
Yeah, that's a really helpful summary, I think, of what I was trying to blather out there. Thank you for that. What we can continuously see Jesus doing is something other than he had the power to do. So this, like, I could have called, like we sing the song, he could have called 10,000 angels, right? He was packing heat. He could have done whatever he wanted and continuously chose not to use the actual power that he had access to for the sake of the other. And so there's something to be said here. Now, some people I think very much would push back on this and say, oh, you're just asking for Christians to be a bunch of pushovers and for people to take advantage of you. And that's not actually what I'm saying. I'm saying that what it means to have stability in your identity and confidence before the Lord manifests itself differently in what it means to hunger and thirst and to pursue righteousness than to think entirely in terms of what's fiscally pragmatic. There's a story maybe I'll throw in here as we bring this to a close, and I'm sure many of you will have stuff you want to push back on. Maybe so send us an email, info@tolltogether.com. Or for those of you on Connect, you can pontificate here with us of how to think through this. But let me close with this story because it's atypical, and I don't know that justice happens, but it's worth considering. This is a story from my I tell Grandpa Rittenhouse stories. This is a great Grandpa Rittenhouse story. When my Grandpa Rittenhouse was a little boy, they, for some reason, had gotten up earlier to milk that morning. And when they went into the barn, they found one of their neighbors who was skimming cream off the top of their milk tank. And you get paid a premium on. So anyway, stealing stuff. But so my grandpa, as a young guy, took off after the dude. And his dad, great Grandpa Rittenhouse, caught him by the coat and pulled him back. And my grandpa said, let me go, Dad. I'm going to get him. And great grandpa said, no. He said, that man has received his punishment already. And my grandpa said, what do you mean, Dad? And he said, he said, I feel sorry for him. He said, when he goes to bed tonight, he's going to have to go to bed with a thief. And I still don't know exactly what I think about that story. Because was the guy morally convicted of what he had done and been caught? Was there a punishment? And my great grandpa was operating under the premise that God would convict that person and that he would feel repentant before the Lord of knowing that he had done something wrong, and that the misery of knowing that you were on the other side of what God intended would be a punishment in and of itself. Even if you didn't get your head knocked in, or sued or charged for damages. It's just a different response. So I think it's one thing to premeditatively think through what is the right thing. It's a different form of character when at 5:30 in the morning, that's your natural reaction to theft. I don't think anybody's born like that. I think that comes from a pretty long, hard fought deep dive into what does it mean for me to grow into the likeness of Christ that I would respond like that. And so there are people out there who are responding in counterintuitive ways, and we could all tell many more stories of people who do that well. That's just one that popped into my mind here, of thinking about what does it mean to live in a Christ-like way in the midst of this. We want to set the bar really, really high, I think, for what we believe that God can do in somebody else's life. And then we want to set the bar really, really low for the degree to which we want to depend on secular concepts of justice to make things right. Be thankful for it. I'm thrilled. I'm tickled that it's against the law to steal cars. I think that's good. I'm saddened that we need a law that in the first place. So part of it is it's the heaviness of recognizing that we live within there's no solidarity left. I think it's not just a fracturing of our vehicles or windshields. It's also the fracturing of what it means to be a culture and have respect for our neighbors. And so all of this symbolizes a whole lot more. And that's why the question is so deep and insightful. But again, I want to thank the listener for the question. I want to thank those of you who are wallowing around in these ideas with us at this moment, is to say that I think, Cameron, increasingly we're going to see the failures of secular systems and moral categories. And we as Christians are going to say, this is bad, but also we're not going to participate in that system in our response to it. And there's something better here to which Christ is calling us. That's an easy thing to say. It's a difficult thing to live out. And I think this is where we will be forced into prayer of, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Teach us to count the cost and to live well in these days in a way that it ultimately is good for your glory and for our neighbor's good, even if my neighbor tries to steal my car. That is tough, but I think the foundation of the potential witness and formation that comes out of leaning into it in that way is something that is admirable and certainly something worth thinking about. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.